I stood there in the middle of my own retirement party, surrounded by colleagues who had become friends over 30 years of dedication and hard work. The room buzzed with laughter and congratulations. Glasses clinked in celebration of my decades of service, and the warm glow of success filled every corner of the banquet hall. My wife Sarah stood beside me with that perfect smile she'd mastered over our 28 years of marriage, the one that could convince anyone she was the happiest woman alive. Little did everyone know, including me at that moment, that this celebration was about to become the most humiliating experience of my entire life. But here's the thing. Sometimes the universe has a funny way of rewarding patience and preparation, and boy, was I prepared. The evening started like any retirement party should, with speeches from my boss praising my contributions to the company, and stories from coworkers about projects we'd conquered together. I had climbed from an entry-level position to chief financial officer, pouring my heart and soul into building not just a career, but a legacy. Every late night, every weekend spent reviewing reports, every business trip that took me away from home had been for my family's future. My daughter Jennifer, 26 years old, and supposedly the light of my life, stood near the buffet table with her phone in hand, barely looking up from her screen. Sarah kept touching my arm, playing the role of the devoted wife to perfection, and I remember thinking how lucky I was to have them both there. About an hour into the party, right after I finished thanking everyone for coming and sharing my plans for retirement, Sarah asked for everyone's attention. Her voice carried across the room with an authority that made everyone fall silent, and she stood there with a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. I thought maybe she had prepared a speech, perhaps a heartfelt tribute to our years together, and my chest swelled with anticipation. She opened that portfolio with theatrical precision, pulled out a stack of papers, and handed them to me with a smile that suddenly looked more predatory than loving. "David," she announced loud enough for everyone to hear, "I think it's time we both started our new chapters separately." The room went so quiet you could hear a pin drop, and my hands trembled as I looked down at the divorce papers she'd just served me in front of my entire professional network. My face burned with humiliation as whispers erupted around us, and I saw the shock and pity in the eyes of people I'd worked with for decades. But what shattered my heart into a million pieces wasn't just Sarah's betrayal. It was the sound of clapping coming from near the buffet table. Jennifer, my own daughter, the girl I'd worked countless hours to provide for, was actually applauding her mother's public humiliation of me. She walked over with her phone held high, recording my reaction like this was some kind of viral content opportunity, and said with a sneer, "Finally, Mom gets what she deserves." I stood there frozen, the papers heavy in my hands, while my brain struggled to process what was happening. Sarah continued her performance, telling everyone how she'd sacrificed her own dreams to support my career, how she'd been lonely all these years, and how she deserved to enjoy her life now with someone who actually appreciated her. The crowd's sympathy shifted in her direction so quickly it made my head spin, and several people actually nodded in understanding. Jennifer chimed in about how I was never there for her dance recitals or school plays, conveniently forgetting that I was working to pay for her private school tuition and college education. My supposed best friend Tom from accounting actually patted Sarah on the shoulder and told her she was brave, while I stood there like a fool holding my divorce papers. But here's where the story takes a turn that nobody, especially not Sarah and Jennifer, saw coming. You see, while they thought they were executing the perfect ambush, I had been playing a much longer game. That smile that crept across my face in that moment of complete humiliation wasn't defeat. It was the beginning of their worst nightmare. I looked at Sarah, then at Jennifer, and simply said, "Okay," before calmly walking out of my own retirement party. The confusion on their faces was priceless, but they assumed my compliance meant they'd broken me completely. What Sarah didn't know was that 6 months earlier, I'd discovered her affair with her tennis instructor, a 28-year-old named Brad, who drove a car that cost more than he made in a year. I'd hired a private investigator after noticing charges on our credit card for hotel rooms in the middle of weekdays when Sarah claimed to be at book club. The evidence was overwhelming. Photos of them together, records of expensive gifts she'd bought him with our money, and text messages that made my stomach turn. But instead of confronting her immediately like any emotional person would, I did something far more strategic. I started planning. I began meeting with the best divorce attorney in the state, a shark named Patricia Chun, who had a reputation for leaving cheating spouses with absolutely nothing. Together, we crafted a strategy that would take time, but would be absolutely bulletproof when executed. Patricia advised me to stay calm, document everything, and most importantly, make some very specific financial moves that were completely legal but devastatingly effective. I followed her instructions to the letter, never once letting Sarah know that I was aware of her betrayal or that I was preparing for exactly the scenario she thought she was orchestrating. The first thing Patricia had me do was review all of our assets, and let me tell you, after 30 years of disciplined saving and investing, we had accumulated quite a portfolio. Our house was worth $1.2 million in the current market, sitting on property that had appreciated significantly since we bought it. We had retirement accounts totaling over $3 million, investment properties bringing in rental income, and a stock portfolio that had performed exceptionally well. Sarah had always left the finances to me, which she now viewed as her golden ticket to a comfortable divorce settlement. She assumed that in our state, she'd automatically get half of everything plus alimony, and she'd been consulting with her own attorney, who apparently confirmed this assumption. What Sarah failed to understand, or what her attorney failed to properly investigate, was the origin of our wealth and how strategically everything had been structured. You see, about 15 years ago, my father passed away and left me a substantial inheritance, roughly $1 million, that formed the foundation of our current wealth. Patricia helped me trace how that inheritance money had been kept separate initially, and then carefully documented how it had grown over the years through my investment decisions. Every major asset purchase, every investment decision, every financial move we'd made, I had meticulous records showing the source of funds and the growth trajectory. But the real masterstroke came from something I'd done 10 years earlier that Sarah had completely forgotten about. When we were refinancing our house and reorganizing our investments, I'd had Sarah sign a postnuptial agreement that she barely read because she trusted me completely. In that agreement, which was reviewed by an independent attorney as required by law, she had acknowledged the separate nature of my inherited assets and their growth. She'd signed away her claim to roughly 70% of what she now thought was community property. Patricia nearly jumped for joy when I showed her that document because it had been properly executed and witnessed. Over those 6 months between discovering her affair and my retirement party, I made several additional strategic moves that were all completely legal and above board. I transferred the titles of our rental properties into a family trust that I controlled, naming my nephew Jake as the beneficiary rather than Jennifer. I moved funds from joint accounts into separate accounts that held only my traced separate property, documenting every transfer with clear paper trails. I even refinanced our primary residence in only my name, which I could do because my credit and income alone qualified, paying off Sarah's name from the title with my separate property funds. By the time she served me those papers, I legally owned everything outright. The week after the retirement party, Sarah moved in with Brad, taking Jennifer with her to Brad's modest apartment across town. They were both so confident and happy, posting photos on social media of their new beginning and talking about the settlement money that would soon be flowing their way. Sarah had apparently promised Jennifer that once the divorce was final, as she got her massive payout, they'd buy a beach house together, and Jennifer would never have to work a real job. Brad was driving a new BMW that I'm certain Sarah bought him with money from our joint account before I froze it. They were living it up, completely unaware of the legal tsunami heading their direction. When Sarah's attorney received the response to her divorce filing, I imagine the scene in that office must have been spectacular. My attorney, Patricia, had filed a counter-petition that laid out exactly how the assets would be divided, which is to say, they wouldn't be divided at all. The response included copies of the postnuptial agreement, documentation of the separate property nature of most of our assets, and a detailed accounting showing that Sarah was entitled to roughly $150,000 total. We also included all the evidence of her affair, the hotel receipts, the private investigator's photos, and the credit card statements showing her lavish spending on Brad. In our state, adultery doesn't prevent someone from getting divorced, but it absolutely affects alimony and property division. Sarah's attorney apparently told her she'd made a catastrophic error by not properly investigating our assets before filing, and that the postnuptial agreement she'd signed was ironclad. Sarah called me screaming, crying, and threatening to fight me in court for years if necessary. I calmly explained that she was welcome to fight, but that every month she delayed would cost her tens of thousands in legal fees that would come out of her small settlement. Patricia had structured everything perfectly, and multiple other attorneys Sarah consulted told her the same thing. She'd been outmaneuvered completely. The house she thought was half hers was solely mine. The retirement accounts she'd planned to raid were protected, and the rental properties she'd already picked out furniture for were beyond her reach. Jennifer called me next, and her tone had shifted dramatically from the triumphant sneer at the retirement party to desperate pleading. She sobbed about how she didn't understand legal stuff and had just been supporting her mother, as if publicly humiliating me was somehow justified by ignorance. She reminded me that she was my daughter, my only child, and that I couldn't possibly cut her off completely. I listened to her cry for about 30 seconds before I calmly explained that she had made her choice when she applauded my humiliation, and that choices have consequences. She'd spent her entire adult life expecting my money to fund her lifestyle without ever building a career or any independence, and that free ride had just ended permanently. The really beautiful part of all this was watching their fantasy life crumble in real time. Brad, it turned out, was only interested in Sarah when she came with the promise of millions in divorce money. Once word got out through their social circles that Sarah was basically broke and facing a messy divorce with no big payout, Brad suddenly had to find himself and moved to Colorado, leaving Sarah heartbroken and homeless. Jennifer couldn't afford the apartment they'd been renting because she'd quit her low-paying retail job, assuming Mom's divorce money was coming soon. They both ended up moving into Sarah's sister's basement, sleeping on air mattresses and sharing a bathroom with 3 other people. About 3 months after the retirement party, both Sarah and Jennifer showed up at my door together, looking haggard and defeated in a way I'd never seen before. Sarah's hair had gray roots showing. Her designer clothes had been replaced with Target basics, and she'd aged what looked like 10 years in just a few months. Jennifer had lost the cocky attitude completely, replaced with red-rimmed eyes and a desperate expression. They stood on my doorstep, the very house they'd assumed would be sold and split, and begged me to reconsider. Sarah actually got down on her knees crying, saying she'd made a terrible mistake and that we could work things out if I just forgave her. Jennifer joined her mother in begging, promising she'd be a better daughter, and that she finally understood how hard I'd worked for our family. They painted a picture of their current living situation that was genuinely pathetic, sharing a basement with Sarah's sister's family, eating ramen noodles most nights, and facing the reality that neither of them had skills or prospects for earning decent money. Sarah's sister was apparently getting tired of supporting them and had given them a 30-day notice to find somewhere else to live. They looked at me with such desperation, such genuine fear about their future, and waited for me to be the solution to their problems like I'd always been before. I stood in the doorway of my beautiful home, the one I'd worked 3 decades to pay for, and I felt absolutely nothing for them. The love I'd had for Sarah had died the moment she handed me those papers in front of everyone I respected professionally. The father-daughter bond I'd cherished with Jennifer had shattered when she recorded my humiliation for her social media followers. I looked at these two people who had plotted my public destruction while living off my hard work, and I knew exactly what I needed to say. My voice was calm, measured, and final when I spoke, and I made sure they understood every single word. Sarah, when you stood in front of all my colleagues and served me divorce papers, you made a choice, I began, watching her face crumple. You chose public humiliation over private conversation. You chose your tennis instructor over 28 years of marriage, and you chose greed over partnership. Jennifer, when you applauded your mother and recorded my pain for entertainment, you chose to be cruel rather than compassionate, disloyal rather than loving. I paused to let that sink in before continuing. Those were your choices, made freely and with full knowledge of what you were doing. Now you both have to live with the consequences of those choices, just like I'm living with mine. Sarah started sobbing harder, reaching for my hand and promising she'd changed, that she'd been stupid and manipulative, but had learned her lesson. Jennifer chimed in about how she was my daughter, and I couldn't just abandon her, that she was sorry for everything and would spend her life making it up to me. They created quite a scene right there on my doorstep, loud enough that my neighbors probably heard everything. But their tears and promises meant nothing to me anymore, because I'd seen their true characters in that retirement party moment. And you can't unsee something like that. They weren't sorry for what they'd done. They were sorry they hadn't gotten away with it. The divorce will be final in 2 months, I told them, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions I was keeping locked down. You'll receive the settlement the court has determined is fair, based on the evidence and our postnuptial agreement, approximately $150,000. I suggest you use that money wisely, perhaps for education or job training, because it's all you're getting from me. Sarah started to protest, but I held up my hand. Jennifer, you're 26 years old, which means you've been an adult for 8 years. Plenty of time to build a career and life independence, but you chose not to, because my money was always there. That was my failure as a father, making things too easy for you, and I won't continue that mistake. I started to close the door, but Jennifer grabbed the frame, her eyes wild with panic about her future. Dad, please, I'm your daughter, your only child. You can't just cut me out of your life completely. Her voice cracked with genuine fear, and part of me, the part that remembered teaching her to ride a bike and reading her bedtime stories, felt a twinge of sympathy. But then I remembered her standing in that banquet hall, with her phone held high, recording my pain, and that sympathy evaporated like morning dew in the desert. You cut yourself out when you chose to participate in my public humiliation, I replied coldly. What about all the years I supported you both, provided everything you needed and most of what you wanted? Sarah tried a different angle, appealing to my sense of fairness and history. Doesn't that count for anything? Don't I deserve some consideration for being your wife for nearly 3 decades? The audacity of that question actually made me laugh, a bitter sound that seemed to echo in the evening air. Sarah, you're absolutely right that you were my wife for a long time, which is exactly why your betrayal cut so deep. You knew me better than anyone, knew how important respect and loyalty were to me, and you chose the most public, humiliating way possible to end our marriage. That wasn't an accident, it was calculated cruelty. The look on both their faces told me they finally understood that there would be no reconciliation, no softening of my position, and no access to my assets beyond what the court had ordered. Sarah's tears turned from hopeful to bitter, and I could see anger starting to replace the desperation in her eyes. Jennifer just looked lost, like a child who'd finally realized that actions have permanent consequences. I felt nothing but relief as I prepared to close the door on this chapter of my life, literally and figuratively. I'm going to give you both one last piece of advice, I said, my hand on the door. Learn to support yourselves, because I will never be your safety net again. After I closed the door, I stood in my foyer listening to them cry and argue with each other on my doorstep for a few more minutes before they finally left. Through the side window, I watched Sarah lean heavily on Jennifer as they walked back to their beat-up old car, the BMW long since repossessed from Brad. They looked like two people who'd bet everything on the wrong horse and were just realizing they'd lost it all. I poured myself a glass of the expensive scotch I'd been saving and sat in my home office, surrounded by the life I'd built through hard work and sacrifice, and I felt genuinely at peace for the first time in months. The divorce was finalized exactly on schedule, with Sarah receiving her court-ordered settlement and nothing more. She tried one last manipulation at the final hearing, crying and telling the judge about her medical issues and how she couldn't work. But Patricia shut that down with medical records, showing Sarah was perfectly healthy. The judge, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s, actually seemed disgusted by Sarah's theatrics and made a comment about people needing to consider consequences before betraying their spouses. Jennifer wasn't at the hearing, apparently too embarrassed to show her face after everything that had happened, and I didn't blame her for that at least. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Sarah eventually moved to another state to live with her elderly mother, taking a job as a receptionist that barely covered her expenses. The $150,000 settlement had been eaten up by her legal fees and paying off credit card debt she'd racked up during her affair with Brad. Jennifer apparently went back to school for nursing, finally building a real career, though I heard she struggled financially and lived with roommates in a sketchy part of town. Part of me wondered if she'd eventually become a good nurse and turn her life around, but that wasn't my concern anymore. As for me, I retired to exactly the life I'd planned, traveling to places I'd always wanted to see, taking up hobbies I'd postponed during my working years, and eventually meeting someone new. Her name is Rebecca. She's a widow with her own retirement savings and grown children, and she understands the value of honesty and loyalty. We met at a cooking class I took on a whim, and our relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. She knows my whole story, and she's never once asked me for anything beyond my time and attention, which makes her more valuable than any amount of money could express. My former colleagues from the retirement party eventually heard the full story through the office grapevine, and several reached out to apologize for their initial sympathy toward Sarah. Tom, my former best friend who'd comforted Sarah that night, actually showed up at my house with a case of beer and a genuine apology. He explained that he'd been completely fooled by Sarah's performance and felt terrible about not supporting me in that moment. I appreciated his apology, and we've rebuilt our friendship, though I'm definitely more guarded about who I trust now, which is probably a healthy thing. Looking back on that retirement party now, almost 2 years later, I can see it as the gift it actually was, even though it didn't feel that way at the time. Sarah and Jennifer did me the favor of showing me their true characters before I spent my retirement being used and manipulated by them. If Sarah had waited until after retirement to reveal her affair and ask for a divorce privately, I might have been generous in the settlement out of guilt or nostalgia. By choosing to humiliate me publicly, by being so confident that they held all the cards, they actually triggered the one response they never anticipated: cold, calculated, strategic opposition. The lesson in all of this isn't really about revenge, though I won't pretend there wasn't satisfaction in watching their plans crumble. The real lesson is about the importance of protecting yourself, even when you trust someone, about keeping proper documentation, and about understanding that love and business should never be completely mixed without safeguards. That postnuptial agreement I'd had Sarah sign 10 years earlier wasn't because I didn't trust her then. It was because my estate attorney had recommended it as basic asset protection, and thank God I listened. Financial literacy and proper legal planning saved me from being destroyed by people who claimed to love me. I also learned that public humiliation, while painful in the moment, can be survived and even overcome with dignity and patience. Everyone at that retirement party saw Sarah serve me divorce papers and Jennifer applaud. But they also eventually learned the whole story of the affair, the manipulation, and the attempted asset grab. My reputation recovered completely while theirs remained tarnished, because the truth eventually came out, and people generally respect someone who handles betrayal with grace rather than retaliation. I never badmouthed them publicly, never posted angry rants on social media, and never tried to turn people against them. I just let the facts speak for themselves. The question people often ask me is whether I would ever reconcile with Jennifer, since she's still my biological daughter regardless of what happened. My answer is complicated because I don't hate her, but I also don't trust her, and probably never will again. If she reached out with genuine remorse, not because she wanted something, but because she'd actually grown as a person and understood the gravity of what she did, I might consider a limited relationship. But that would take years of her proving herself, and I'm not holding my breath. Some bridges once burned can never be fully rebuilt, and maybe that's okay. Sarah, on the other hand, is completely dead to me in every way that matters. The woman I loved for 28 years was apparently never real, just a performance she maintained while planning her exit strategy. When someone shows you who they really are through their cruelest actions, believe them and act accordingly. I wasted enough years supporting someone who viewed me as an ATM with a pulse, and I refused to waste one more second of my life on her. The divorce papers she served me so dramatically were actually the best gift she ever gave me, because they freed me from a lie I'd been living. These days, I spend my time exactly how I want, answering to no one and supporting only causes and people I genuinely believe in. I volunteer at a financial literacy nonprofit, teaching young people about the importance of asset protection and proper financial planning, using my own story as a cautionary tale. I travel extensively with Rebecca, exploring cultures and cuisines we've both always wanted to experience. I've reconnected with old friends I'd lost touch with during my marriage, guys who Sarah hadn't approved of because they weren't sophisticated enough for her image. My life is fuller and more authentic now than it was when I was supposedly happily married with a loving family. The house that Sarah thought she'd get half of, I ended up selling for a significant profit and bought a smaller place better suited to my retirement lifestyle. The rental properties continue generating income that funds my adventures and charities. The investment portfolio keeps growing, and I've updated my will to leave everything to various charities and my nephew Jake, who actually appreciates hard work and family loyalty. Jennifer won't inherit a single dollar from me, and I'm completely at peace with that decision. She had every opportunity to build a relationship based on love rather than money, and she chose poorly. Sometimes late at night, I think about that moment at the retirement party when Sarah handed me those papers and Jennifer started clapping. I remember the shock, the humiliation, and the pain of public betrayal by the two people I'd sacrificed everything for. But then I remember the smile that crossed my face, the one that confused them both, and I realized that smile wasn't defeat or shock, it was recognition. I recognized in that moment that I'd already won a game they didn't even know we were playing, and that their moment of triumph was actually the beginning of their downfall. That smile was the smile of someone who'd planned for every contingency and was about to watch karma do its work. The truth about relationships, whether marriage or family, is that they're only as strong as the character of the people in them. All the love in the world can't overcome a fundamental lack of integrity, loyalty, and respect. Sarah and Jennifer showed me that they lacked all three of these qualities when it mattered most, and no amount of tears or begging after the fact could change that reality. I gave them the life they wanted to live off of my hard work, and they responded by trying to humiliate and destroy me publicly. The only appropriate response to that level of betrayal was to cut them off completely and let them face the natural consequences of their choices. If you're listening to this story and you're in a relationship where you feel unappreciated, used, or disrespected, take it as a warning. Protect yourself legally and financially, Document everything, and don't assume that love alone will prevent betrayal. The sad reality is that some people view relationships as transactions, and once they think they can get more by leaving than staying, they'll leave without hesitation. The postnuptial agreement that saved me isn't romantic, but neither is divorce court, and I'd rather be protected than sorry. Love should be genuine, but trust should be verified, especially when substantial assets are involved. And if you're someone who's considering betraying a spouse or parent who supported you, especially if you're planning some dramatic public reveal like Sarah did, let my story be your warning. The person you're betraying might be smarter than you think, more prepared than you imagine, and less willing to be a victim than you assume. That moment of satisfaction you get from your dramatic gesture might cost you everything in the long run. Sarah and Jennifer learned this lesson the hardest way possible, and they'll spend the rest of their lives dealing with the consequences of one spectacularly stupid decision. My retirement hasn't turned out anything like I planned when I was working all those years, but in many ways, it's better. I'm free from toxic people, surrounded by genuine relationships, and living authentically for the first time in decades. The price of that freedom was the pain of betrayal and the courage to cut off people who shared my DNA and my history, but it was absolutely worth it. Sometimes the family you choose is better than the family you're born with, and sometimes walking away from toxic people is the healthiest thing you can do, even if society tells you that family should stick together no matter what. So that's my story, from the humiliation at my retirement party to the peace I found by standing firm and protecting what I'd earned. Sarah thought she was going to ride off into the sunset with half of everything plus alimony, and Jennifer thought she'd never have to work because Mom was getting paid. Instead, they're both struggling to survive while I'm living my best life, and I don't feel even a tiny bit guilty about it. They made their choices, I made mine, and the universe decided who deserved to win. If that makes me cold or heartless in your eyes, I can live with that judgment, because I know the full truth of what happened, and I know I did exactly what I needed to do to protect myself from people who wanted to destroy me.